So, what is a Filipino-American? So, what are you? Chinese or Japanese? Filipino. Oh. I've been having some form of that conversation my whole life. It's like every time I say Filipino, I can just see the comprehension leave their eyes. For the record, my mom's Filipino-American, my dad's German-Swedish American. They met in California, they got married, and here I am. But look, I don't really blame people for not knowing what a Filipino is. Until recently, I didn't even really understand much about it myself. The Philippines is a country in the western Pacific Ocean, just south of Taiwan. The country is made up of over 7,000 islands and is home to 108 million Filipinos. There are just over 4 million Filipino-Americans living in the U.S., making up about 18% of the total Asian American population. So how is it that people from an obscure country in the Pacific account for the third largest Asian population in the U.S.? Let's talk about it. Before we get started, I just want to point out that humans have been in the Philippines for at least 37,000 years. So that means Filipino history does not start where this story starts. And it doesn't start when Europeans arrived either. By the early 16th century, Columbus had already been to the Americas, and Europe was deep into their age of exploration. At this time, the Philippines was populated by a diverse mixture of tribal peoples. Chinese merchants were present conducting trade with mainland Asia, and there was even a strong Muslim presence. So in 1521, on Easter Sunday, a Spanish expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan landed in the Philippines, in what is now the province of Cebu. In typical imperial fashion, he immediately claimed the whole place for the Catholic Church and Spain. He was promptly killed after getting entangled in intertribal warfare. After he was killed, Magellan's expedition quickly left and the Spanish didn't return for 20 years. When another expedition arrived with the goal of setting up a Spanish trading post, this effort ultimately failed as well. But the leader of that expedition did name the islands the Filipinas after the Crown Prince Philip. The Spanish eventually returned a third time and successfully colonized the Philippines. Now fast forward 300 years and the world is a very different place. By this time, the United States had completed its continental expansion, from the original 13 colonies all the way to California, and some were itching for more. Memories of the Civil War were fading fast, and ideas like manifest destiny were very popular. Jingos like Theodore Roosevelt were pushing for a more aggressive foreign policy, verging on imperialism. Roosevelt even went so far as to say, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Spain, on the other hand, was a power in decline. The once enormous Spanish Empire was now a shadow of its former self, but they still retained a few rebellious territories, including the Philippines and, importantly, Cuba. In 1895, the Cuban Revolution kicked off, sparking a brutal crackdown by the Spanish military. The most powerful newspapers of the time published graphic descriptions of the suffering that resulted, and American sympathy swung in favor of Cuban independence. To protect American citizens, the U.S. Navy sent the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor, where it suddenly exploded. To this day, it still remains unclear what caused the explosion, but America blamed Spain, and on April 25th, the U.S. declared war, and the very lopsided Spanish-American War began. Almost immediately, a U.S. fleet led by Commodore Dewey left Hong Kong and very quickly reached the Philippines. On May 1st, Dewey's fleet steamed into Manila Bay to confront the Spanish Navy, and the first major battle of the war began. By the end of the battle, only a single Spanish ship remained afloat, and over 200 Spanish sailors had died. In contrast, the U.S. had not lost a single ship, and only a single sailor died of heat stroke. By the time American troops arrived in the Philippines, tens of thousands of Filipino nationalist rebels had already driven the Spanish from the countryside and placed Manila, the capital, under siege. Fearing reprisals and viewing themselves as superior, the Spanish in Manila refused to surrender to Filipinos. So after secretly negotiating a deal with the Americans, the Spanish surrendered to U.S. troops. The Filipino rebels were naturally upset at being left out of the negotiations, and for being robbed of the opportunity to take the capital back themselves. And as a result, tensions grew between the Filipino rebels and the U.S. troops. What happened next is a confusing mess. The only reason the U.S. was in the Philippines was because they were at war with Spain. The problem is that the U.S. government had neglected to decide what they were going to do with the Philippines when the war was over. They lacked a clear policy towards the rebel Filipinos who were fighting for their own independence. After months of internal debate and negotiations with Spain, a peace treaty was signed, granting independence to Cuba, while Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were purchased for $20 million. The decision was made with the idea that Filipinos were incapable of self-government. There were also fears that if the US did not take the Philippines, another great power would swoop in and take them anyways. Of course, all this deal-making and haggling took place without any Filipino representatives present, and there were still tens of thousands of armed rebels camped out in the Philippines. It's important to understand that at this point in history, though the US Navy is a modern fighting force, the US Army is a mess. It was composed of inexperienced volunteers and crusty old Civil War officers who'd been chasing Native Americans for the past 30 years. On the evening of February 4th, 1899, after living for months in close proximity with each other, a confused skirmish broke out between Filipino forces and American troops, and the Philippine-American War began. The Philippine-American War would last for years, becoming deeply unpopular in the US. Where only 379 US soldiers died in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War would cost 4,200 American lives, and up to 200,000 Filipinos would die before the US successfully pacified the country. The Philippines would spend the next 40 years under US control. It was a deeply complicated time. Americans had brutally crushed the Filipino rebels, burning villages and committing atrocities. At the same time, they built roads and infrastructure and schools across the country. Waves of Filipino immigrants, including some of my own ancestors, came to the United States, working on Hawaiian plantations and California farmland. Over the years, the Philippines gained more and more independence, and by the start of World War II, they were an autonomous commonwealth under the control of their very own president. They were even scheduled to be completely independent in 1945. Unfortunately, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The very next day, the Japanese attacked the Philippines from the air. Japanese troops landed in Luzon, and the invasion began. The Japanese steadily pushed US and Filipino forces back, until after months of fighting, they were forced to surrender. And this is where my family's story enters the picture. It would be easy to focus on battles and famous generals, but the fact is that when the Japanese bombed the Philippines from the air, they not only destroyed US airplanes, they also killed most of my great-grandfather's family. At the time, my family lived in Bani, in the province of Pangasinan. My grandfather was only a child at the time, but he still recalls with vivid detail hiding in caves when Japanese troops came to town. He remembers the atrocities that the Filipinos suffered at the hands of the Japanese. And he remembers the resistance too. After 2 years of occupation, in 1944, the United States returned to the Philippines and liberated the country. It was this experience, Filipinos and Americans fighting together, that directly led to my grandfather joining the US Navy. Yeah, that was the thing. Between 1952 and 1990, around 34,000 Filipinos joined the US Navy, and my grandfather was one of them. He served in the Navy for 21 years. He would be stationed in Hawaii, where he met my grandmother. He would have American children and lead an American life. And that's how we got here. At least, that's one way a Filipino became an American.